Hello and welcome to the Ukraine Shelf, a podcast where we discuss the best books in English about Ukraine and speak to their authors about Ukraine's history, culture, politics, and its meaning for the world. The podcast is a collaboration between the Ukrainian Institute London, University College London European Institute, and the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and it is supported by the British Academy. This is a very special edition of the Ukraine Shelf because we are recording for the first time in Ukraine, in Lviv, and we're so happy to be partnering with the Index Center for Documentation and Exchange and its director, Sasha Dovzhik, and with Dim Zvuku, where we are recording in front of a live audience. My name is Olena Jennings, and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London, but I'm also a native of Lviv, so this is a very, very moving moment for me. In fact, I recorded several programs here as a child many years ago in this very building, so it's very nice to be back. Alongside me is my co-presenter and co-creator of the podcast, Owen Blacker, Associate Professor of Ukrainian and East European Culture at UCL.
Thank you, Olena. Yeah, it's a huge thrill to be recording in Lviv, and all the more so as we have two amazing guests with us on the podcast today. First of all, we have Yuliya Musakovska, multi-award-winning poet and translator from Lviv. Yuliya has published 6 volumes of poetry in Ukrainian and has published in many journals in Ukraine and internationally in translation. And indeed, her work has been translated into more than 30 languages. Since 2022, Yuliya has been a powerful voice representing Ukraine at many international events. And we will talk today about her first collection in English translation, The God of Freedom, which was published in 2024 by Arrowsmith Press and translated by Olena Jennings with Yuliya herself. This is a book which approaches the experience of living through war with a remarkable combination of subtlety, beautiful, surreal imagery and metaphor, and also frequently cold rage. Our second guest is Maria Tumarkin, a Ukrainian Jewish Australian writer, essayist, and cultural historian, and a lecturer at the School of Culture and Communication at Melbourne University, and she's originally from Kharkiv. Maria has written 4 books that blend essay, memoir, cultural history, and philosophy, and they include Traumascapes, which explores places in various parts of the world that bear the scars of traumatic events, Otherland, an account of a journey back to the former Soviet Union with her daughter, Courage, which looks at the idea of courage as she describes it, a messy, explosive, and morally ambivalent phenomenon, and most recently, Axiomatic, which is a study of how the past, as she puts it, infiltrates the present. Welcome, Yuliya and Maria.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
And this is the first episode of the Ukraine Shelf where we will discuss poetry. So, Yuliya, can we begin by asking you to give our listeners a taste of your collection, The God of Freedom? And so that our listeners who do not know Ukrainian yet can enjoy your poem, can we begin by asking you to read the translation and then the original?
Of course. The God of Submission. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. Warm, supple flesh is intoxicating. The whip falls, a flower blooms beneath it. Those that haven't been wriggling hurt less. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. Fresh straw and water in a trough for a cough. Simply believe and stop shooting back. Only the godless sleep with one eye unshut. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. The God of submission asks for bloody sacrifice. Being tightly bound is still better than dead. Those singing out of the tune will be slaughtered first. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. Bells on their necks ring loud like cathedrals. Metal rings pierce their nostrils mercilessly. Mother cows smell good, but are forbidden to feed. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. They can be spread like honey and put on a wound. They will be watching and chewing diligently in the grass where a soldier is dying. The God of submission loves gentle coughs. This is translated by Olena Jennings, and now I will read it in Ukrainian. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Тепла, піддатлива плоть одурманює швидко. Цілить батіг, і під ним розпускається квітка. Тим, що не смикались, менше удари болять. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Свіжа солома, вода у поїлці в теляти. Просто повірити і перестати стріляти. Тільки безбожники з оком розплющеним сплять. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Бог упокорення просить кривавої жертви. Міцно прив'язані все-таки краще, ніж мертві. Перші підуть на забій, хто співає невлад. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Б'ють, наче дзвони соборні, дзвіночки на шиї. Кільця заліза безжалісно ніздрі прошили. Мукають мамки пахучі, та їм не велять. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят. Їх би мастити, як мед, і тулити до рани. Їм би дивитися і ремигати старанно поміж трави, у якій помирає солдат. Бог упокорення любить ласкавих телят.
Thank you so much, Yuliya, for reading so beautifully. The title of the collection is The God of Freedom. The title of the poem is The God of Submission. And these two concepts, freedom and submission, svoboda и upokorення, create a kind of tension in the poem and in the collection. It's a tension which has very much characterized Ukrainian artistic expression for many, many years, for centuries even. Ukrainian writers so often have fought for their freedom, paid with their lives for that freedom. Could you tell us what that means, that word means specifically to you today, and tell us about that tension between freedom and submission that you explore in the collection?
I will start by saying that this book was originally published in 2021, and it contains poems written since 2016. So I didn't have a clear intent of writing a book about freedom. That is not how poetry books are being put together. But I was living in this theme for quite a while, ever since 2014, the revolution of dignity and the the beginning of the actual Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I carried this theme with me and thought about it a lot. And naturally, I was thinking about this dimension of freedom, which is freedom of a country, independence, sovereignty. But I was exploring also other dimensions of freedom. And I did so by diving into my own experiences, my family's history, of course, our country's history, and the stories, the people that I met, many of them women. So I was looking into the past, trying to assess the present, and also in a way maybe envision the future. So of course the God of submission is the antagonist to the God of freedom, and this is the eternal conflict. And now probably the word that stands closest to freedom is dignity, but also another one is survival. So for Ukrainians, freedom is survival, and it's not just physical survival, but the survival of our national identity. And I mean, one couldn't argue that freedom is the most precious thing for Ukrainians. They may be called the freedom worshippers, but generally I think it's the most important thing for anyone in the world. It's the thing that makes life worthwhile, and it is a foundation to any other human values. So I was looking at the situations when freedom is being threatened or limited or taken away, and what happens with each of us, or what happens to that particular person. And the most natural urge is to resist. And what is that helps us resist? It is the spirit. It is the spirit of freedom. And that is how it led me to thinking about the concept of the book. So I was exploring freedom in different aspects. It may be a freedom of self-fulfillment in a relationship, which is very relevant for women, since Ukraine is still pretty much a patriarchy. Also, freedom of a child when it is being brought up in a family, of how we balance discipline and freedom for a child. Also, when freedom is restricted when you are sick, probably also confined to the hospital, and of course, freedom of one's country, as I mentioned in the beginning. So this is this divine force of freedom that transforms you when your freedom is attacked. And another thing, this book has also an unwritten dedication to my father, who has suffered for his love for freedom back in the 1970s. So we all know that Soviet Union was a totalitarian state where you could be punished for any pursuit of freedom, and my father was, for his exploration of languages and different cultures. And the title itself comes probably from two things. One is the dialogues that my father told me about when speaking to KGB, and they asked him mockingly, "Are you praying to some kind of god? Why are you resisting?" And then at the same time, I was reading a novel by Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things. And I was also thinking about how in Christianity, a human being is an embodiment of the maker, the God who has created humans. And this way, we could say that in pursuit of freedom, a person becomes a true embodiment of the God of freedom.
Thank you for that beautiful answer, Yuliya. And thank you for touching on the subject of survival. We will come back to that in this conversation. So we opened our episode with Yuliya's extremely powerful poem. Maria, you're primarily a prose writer, but your prose is very particular. You're very sensitive to the texture, to rhythm of narrative voice, and even to the way that the words are arranged on the page. And for me, your prose is extremely poetic. Is it? Do you agree that it is poetic? Is it important for your prose, for prose about the subjects that we're discussing, to be poetic? What does it mean?
I have to say that I'm still inside Yuliya's poem, both in Ukrainian and in English, and I can't shake it off. It's a real problem, Yuliya, that you've created.
Sorry about that.
The power of that freedom, it just, and the way it enters your body and then touches your soul via your body as well, and your skin and everything. So I do think that poetry, particularly at times of war, survival, violence, incessant loss, is probably the most powerful, not to create hierarchies, but the most powerful literary form. So if you said to me 5 years ago, your prose is poetic, do you agree? I may have had some misgivings, but I don't anymore. I take it as a compliment, because to me there is something that poetry can do that cannot be done in any other way, and it can rearrange you from inside in 3 sentences, like I think Yuliya's poem did for me. And even my voice, I can't quite control my voice, I think, because of the effect of it. It matters to me how my sentences interact, how my paragraphs, how my words interact with the readers' bodies, with their souls, with their minds. It really, really matters how they breathe on the page. The worst thing for me is the idea of dead language. So I always look for sentences that are dead on arrival or have kind of just dried up and shriveled up and can no longer hold that spirit that Yuliya was talking about. And I expunge those sentences mercilessly. So even though the genre in which I work is creative nonfiction, and it's very much nonfiction in its commitment to veracity, to truth, to rigorous examination, to very kind of unwavering ethical framework, the creative part, at its best, I think does take, certainly I feel for me, does take me somewhere in the domain of poetry. So I take it as a compliment, Olesa.
It was meant as such, for sure.
Part of that process, I think, what you're describing and what both of you do in different ways in your work is it's to speak, but it's also to be silent. And this question of silence, of gaps, of not speaking or not being able to speak, or blank spaces on the page, these are things that come up in your work. Yuliya, you've said in some interviews that you found it difficult to even justify the act of writing after the full-scale invasion. You said that you feel a greater need to be silent than to write sometimes. And one of the poems in The God of Freedom, indeed, this question comes up several times, I think, in the collection, but one of the poems is built around this central image of this serpent of silence, which can wrap itself around your neck and kind of squeeze language out of you, and it's a very powerful image. Can you tell us about the role of silence in your work?
Mm-hmm. So the Serpent of Silence poem is from The God of Freedom, so it was written before the full-scale invasion. And I think my relationship with silence was different at that time, because still most of us felt the presence of war, but it was somewhere in the distance. The time when really the question of whether I'm allowed, whether I have a moral right to speak or to act as a poet and continue with my creative writing came after the full-scale invasion began. So first and foremost, I think I felt that my poetic craft has no use in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. I also felt that I have no right to speak on behalf of someone else rather than me, And I felt also that I was quite in a quite privileged position, so I should step back and give others space to speak up. But then at the same time, there was this feeling, there was this urgent need to speak out. First of all, to express what was going on internally, and the secondly, to reach the audiences, to call out, to ask people to support Ukraine, to inform them of what was going on. And also, there were people who came up to me and told me that you need to speak on behalf of us. Thank you for speaking through your poetry and through these discussions. And I was, of course, very humbled. I was very hesitant whether I should continue doing that. But the simplest reason for silence is the pain that we all feel. This is a pain which is in a way collective. It's a shared pain when the body and the soul of our country is attacked, when our friends or just fellow Ukrainians suffer. And also our own personal grievances and losses, they influence our ability to speak. And in my more recent book, I say that speaking about the war is as if speaking with a mouth full of stones and nails. It is extremely painful, but we have to keep in mind that the enemy's goal is to silence us. So this is by speaking that we also resist.
Maria, listening to Yuliya, I can see very clear parallels with some of the writing that you've done on the question of speaking, but also not speaking, choosing to stay silent, especially when it comes to survivors. So when we're thinking about war trauma, why might it be absolutely essential to share the narratives, those traumatic narratives, especially those of survivors, and why might it be important to stay silent, to withhold those stories?
I should say that, Yuliya, you are speaking from the inside, and you have been in Ukraine all this time. I'm speaking from outside. This is my first time back in Ukraine from 2022. I think that distinction needs to be made. So even my ability to speak now, I feel like being silent in response to your question about speech and silence, but I will try to find words and also try to allow silences there as well. So I often think that, and this is not kind of my thinking, and I've read some cultural theorists and linguists talking about silence as the continuation of speech by other means, and that speech and silence are not oppositional necessarily, and often not oppositional. They're part of the continuum, and there is a movement back and forth between speech and silence. And the kind of, I will get to your question, Olesa, I just want to address something that, William, you were talking about, the kind of silences inside the speech, right? Silences on the page. And I have always been really compelled by the idea of bringing silence into my writing and looking for ways to do so. Sometimes it is that kind of withholding that you were talking about, Olesa, the undersaying rather than the oversaying. Sometimes it's the sharp break, the sharp U-turn that points to what cannot be spoken, but to what is palpably present. Sometimes, as you said, William, it's the use of white space, of the negative space, the need for the page to breathe, the need for the words to be infused with things that cannot be said, right? So I believe in coexistence. I don't believe that this is the choice, that it's ever in writing, on the page, on the screen, however you write and read, that it's the choice between speech and silence. So I feel it's that coexistence is there. In terms of the question that you asked, Olesa, about sort of the conversations that I've had with survivors of various sort of catastrophic events in histories and ongoing realities. What I have come to believe is that for a survivor, both options are deeply compromised and absolutely charged with pain. You know, if you don't speak, and this is, Yulia, what you were talking about, the enemy wants us to be silent, right? If you don't speak, there is an element of capitulation, of surrender, of allowing other voices, other words, other narratives to prevail, right? If you don't speak, then the world will not know, and the world will turn away. It's already turning away. So the need to speak and to bring the world back and to make the world not look away, that is very, very powerful in so many survivors that I have certainly spoken to. But there is also this painful knowledge that every time you speak, you will not be heard fully, that only people who have gone through what you have gone can hear everything you've got to say. So you will always be misunderstood in some way. You will always be shortchanged in the act of your words and your experiences being received. There will always be that gap. There will always be this moment of loneliness. I am alone in this moment because people cannot hear fully what I'm saying. So there is this conflict that does not go away, I think. And I've spoken to people who have made a life out of testifying, right? They have committed themselves to a lifetime, whatever's left for them, of testifying. And you see those moments of deep loneliness. Their commitment is unshakable, but the loneliness is there as well. And I'm reluctant to blame it all on language, that language cannot carry what they've got to say. I think there is just something about, Primo Levi talked about, after Holocaust and surviving concentration camps, he talked about the horror of the unlistened to or unwitnessed to, I can't quite remember, story. And he had this, I think still in the camps, he had this recurrent kind of, not even a dream, like a daydream, right, of coming back home, being in the kitchen, telling to his family what it was like and not being heard. And I think that horror of speaking, but your speech not reaching those who it intends to reach, that horror is not just to do with language, it's to do with human nature, it's to do with geopolitics, it's to do with all sorts of other things. So that's on my mind as well. But to come back to what Yulia was talking about, ultimately, in survivors I've spoken to, between the two, deeply flawed, deeply compromised, deeply painful choice, or options of speech and silence, they choose speech.
Continuing this theme of looking for the sort of language that could be spoken but also heard. You both work across languages. Maria, you write in English, but it is not your native tongue, and yet it is the most comfortable language for you to work in. Yulia, you've translated your own and other people's poetry, and also after the full-scale invasion, your first poem was written in English, and that could be interpreted as direct access to the audiences that you wanted to reach, but maybe there's also some distance that was being created from the trauma by not communicating it in your own language, in your native tongue. So my question is to both of you, tell us what it's like working across languages, between languages. How does it help, or maybe how does it challenge you? Yulia?
I will start by saying that since my early years, I've been sort of functioning in a multilingual environment due to my mixed ethnical background and my father's love for languages and other reasons. And I was forming very different relationships with these languages. For example, Russian was spoken at home with my parents at that time, but for me, it was always a kitchen language, a very simple day-to-day, which never became a language of my writing. So Ukrainian was the language of my poetry, education, communicating with externally outside of house. Then there was Polish introduced by my grandmother. And there was English that my father started teaching me at the age of 4, I think. And then I added my own languages, my new languages to that, among them Swedish. And in this crowd of languages, I was forming and also reinventing my relationships with these languages. English became my work language, and it has been for over 20 years. But it was nowhere near to being a creative tool, like it was with Ukrainian. But at that point of time, which you, Olesa, mentioned, the first poem which I was able to get out of myself at that point, I think it was March 2022. It was in English for a certain reason. Of course, it is less painful to write in a foreign language, and English being quite usual for me. It was easy to do so, and also there was an urge for direct contact with the audiences and all these people who were reaching out with the messages, I'm sure not just to me, but to all of you, asking, how are you there in Ukraine? Are you in a safe place? And I was answering many of these messages in English. So this poem came out as a response to all of these questions, sort of describing the reality internally in Ukraine. And the way I realized it was a poem, it was by the last line, which was addressed to the reader. Are you in the safe place? In the circumstances where the international rules-based order is crumbling and the independent sovereign country is being invaded and people are being killed. So then there was this need for more and more accounts and opinions about what's happening in Ukraine that would go directly to the English-speaking audience, and that is where I started to transform my relationship with English. And I think it went quite successfully, but it is different with poetry. I think that one poem remained the only one so far.
Maria.
So my family immigrated from Ukraine before it was independent, when it was still part of the Soviet Union. We immigrated at the end of '89, just a month after the Berlin Wall came down. So I entered English as a teenager, which is not recommended.
I can testify to that.
Yes. And I had this huge inferiority complex about it, and I thought that I could not be a writer in English. My mother tongue was Russian, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to do other things with my life. So I wrote poetry as a child, etc. It's not going to happen. And I studied history, and I thought that I resolved, and I could do history in English. I thought that was, okay, I dealt with that particular problem in my life, that particular existential crisis. And then when I was writing my PhD, which was kind of interdisciplinary, but still, just a text on sites of trauma, I realized that I didn't care about being an academic. I had absolutely no academic ambitions whatsoever. And all I wanted to do was reach readers and make them laugh and cry and connect with them. And, and I just couldn't lie to myself anymore. So then I started trying to write in English, and I had my first book published in English. And, in my sort of 20s, I was trying to pass, and I was suffering because I was not sounding like a native speaker, and then the editors would straighten me out. It felt wrong. I felt like I was robbed of some kind of essential spirit of my writing, who I was. I felt alienated from my own writing after it was straightened out. But I also thought that I had to submit, the god of submission, and I just had to. That was how it was. It's only kind of a little bit later in my long life that I started meeting some editors who started saying, no, you write in accented English and we should not edit you to sound like a native speaker. And it was a real revelation. And my partner, who edits me and has been editing me for the past 15 years, I highly recommend forming partnerships with your editors. He started saying, no, stop holding back. And if anything, he was encouraging me to go wilder into all the ways in which my English was not the native speaker's English, and to really own it, and to really not be in a state of conflict about it. So, and then I started reading other writers who were not born into English, and I came to understand, with their help and in terms of my own responses to their writing, which I found riveting and enduring in their significance, that actually English language needed people like us, the mongrels, and and that we were keeping English language alive. And I remember Bosnian American writer, or Bosnian writer who lives in America, maybe he's back in Sarajevo, Alexander Hammond, talking about it. English needs us because we have, nothing is taken for granted, nothing is a given, nothing can be unexamined, right? Everything is examined, every word, we have to form a relationship with, otherwise it's going to be completely hollowed out of meaning. And that extra sweat and that extra kind of dancing that we do with language actually produces really, writing worth reading. And I remember reading Eva Hoffman, who is a Polish-born writer who was born straight after the Second World War to her parents were Holocaust survivors. They immigrated to Canada in her childhood, and she wrote this language memoir called Lost in Translation. Yeah, and it really helped me because she talked about, what it means to kind of, grow into language when you're not born into language. And she talks about how when you come into a new language, whatever it might be, the word river does not have the spirit of riverness. It's just like 5 letters, R-I, whatever, right? And how it's just like it doesn't smell of river, it doesn't flow. I think it's not magnetized with meaning, with memories, I think she talks about like the haze of connotations and reverberations and so forth. And then slowly, 10 years, 20 years in, the word river, you can hear rivers flowing through the word river, and you connect to the rivers that in other languages, and you no longer live some kind of split existence, right? You're able to bring all the other rivers into that word, and all of a sudden it's vibrating on the page for you in the way that it wasn't, in your first 10 years or whatever in the language. And that really, really helped me. I was like, okay, I just have to wait. It's just a matter of time. And I waited and waited and waited, and now the word river in English has Kharkiv in it and has other places in it. It flows. Yeah.
This brings us on to very neatly onto my next question for you, which is that you mentioned places just now, and this is another thing that I think both of you write about in interesting and different ways. Also in relation to trauma. Obviously, one of the things we've talked about how trauma affects our language and our ability to speak coherently about our experiences, but traumatic experience can also influence our experience of place. When we interact with places where terrible things happened. And obviously this is a question which is very, very relevant to Ukraine today. And I was struck that both of you have actually written about the same city in this context, and that's not a Ukrainian city, but it's Sarajevo. You mentioned it already. Yuliya, you have a very powerful poem which is not from the God of Freedom, and it's as yet untranslated, but that's a task for a future translator, and I'm sure it will be translated. And it describes a conversation between a Ukrainian and a Bosnian about how does one live in a war-torn city, and how does one experience that city. And it includes a line in my very hasty translation: 3.5 years of siege, a year and a half under rockets and shaheds. Children are two streams of voices, inevitably becoming one, like our experiences. So here voices, experiences meet in the kind of dialogue between two cities, two places. And obviously, Maria, you've written very powerfully about Sarajevo in Traumascapes, and one of the lines from Traumascapes that really struck me was places compel meaning. I really like that, and this is about Sarajevo, and this is so places compel meaning. They are a persistent reality check on all our versions of past and present. That's the kind of the way that we think about the narratives that we build can come up against the kind of physical reality of a city. And that allows you to allows us to sort of resist maybe oversimplistic meanings imposed on places from outsiders. Maria, could you first tell us a little bit about this idea of a place as a bearer of trauma, a place as a bearer of meaning, and how also we might think of places as being in dialogue with one another?
Yes, so I've mentioned briefly my PhD as the moment in which I couldn't hide from myself anymore. But my PhD was on sites of trauma. It was initially on trauma, and then I realized that actually to get to trauma, because at the time it was in 1990s, forgive this detour, I'm going to try to talk as fast as possible. But in 1990s, there were these kind of dominant paradigms of talking about trauma. It was the clinical sort of paradigm where trauma was, as it continues to be, conflated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and had a kind of a pathological framework, or a clinical framework, if you like. Then there was the kind of, just the general cultural uses of trauma, where it was a synonym for anything just powerfully bad, and distressing. Then there was the journalistic kind of register. And then there was the kind of trauma theories coming through, influenced by psychoanalysis, but going towards kind of certainly, cultural theory. And they talked about unrepresentability of trauma, its unspeakability, and all of those things were not right, and I was like, beating my head against metaphorical and some non-metaphorical walls, trying to find a way, because I wanted to write and research trauma, but I couldn't find a way in. And then it was place that showed me the way to trauma. So it was through place, and then foregrounding sites of trauma and physical, concrete, material sites of trauma, and making them the kind of the protagonists of my writing, that I was able then to talk both about place and trauma in a way that was not beholden to all the kind of existing paradigms that did not feel somehow honest or sort of, true enough to what I was seeing with my eyes and what I was thinking with my head. And what I started going to various sites of trauma, this was in the late 1990s, and I went to Sarajevo. And what I realized is that the kinds of questions that were, firstly what I realized that sites of trauma had profound cultural significance. And they were kind of, they were at the center of so many things that were kind of, profoundly important to us as individuals, members of communities and nations. And that is grieving, that is meaning-making, and that is remembering as well. So they were kind of hugely important actors in those processes, both collective and individual. They were not sort of backdrops, they were not the wallpaper, they were not they were where the action, the kind of the deep cultural, psychic, collective and individual action was taking place. That was a revelation to me. And then slowly the other thing that I realized was that the kinds of questions that people were asking around sites of trauma were, what do we do with those sites of trauma? And I felt that that question could not be properly answered until the more foundational question was asked, which is what these places do to us. And this is how I started kind of going deeper into this, into the role of places as kind of, agents, if you like. I can't think of a better word right now, of memory and memory across generations as agents of meaning making, as sites where communities are formed, new communities, communities of mourners, new publics are formed, as sites where individual survivors can actually have an experience of the burden of remembering, the burden of testifying, being kind of transferred onto the site, if you like, and so the burdens that they feel being both socially legible and shared, which I think is hugely important because people feel crushed when they're alone with the responsibility to testify, particularly when the world moves on. I saw that sites of trauma were hugely important for all sorts of justice-seeking missions and impulses and so forth. So I stayed with that, with the idea of places being primary rather than secondary, and what they do to us being primary rather than secondary. And I felt that all the conversations were dominated by, do we memorialize, do we rebuild, do we erase? But actually places themselves were already, as you said, William, they were already they were already doing a lot of memorial work. They were already doing, in conjunction with us, human beings and communities and so forth, they were already doing a lot of memory work. So it was misguided to think that you're going to go and put a memorial on a place, and that's what memorialization looks like. So digging under the skin of those places and their kind of immense cultural power and the immense intergenerational effect on us and as individuals and communities kind of gave me, I guess, that sort of insight. And I hope that this will be and may already be useful for Ukraine as well, just not to be caught up in the question of reconstruction in a particular way and the question of memorialization in a particular way, if possible, and to slow down around what the places do to us before we jump onto what should we do with places when we are in the position to do things with places.
Yeah, certainly for me, rereading Traumascapes recently was very useful in just thinking about Ukraine today and how it might look and how people might deal with these places going forward. It's a really, really valuable book in that sense. And I want to turn to you, Yuliya, and return to this poem and that decision that you made to build this dialogue, this bridge between a Ukrainian city and Sarajevo. What made you take that decision, and what did that decision help you to maybe understand about what Maria was talking about how we relate to places where traumatic things have happened and how those places produce meanings for us?
And that poem that you quoted stems from a very personal story. And it goes exactly like it says in the first lines of the poem. It was my friend that I haven't seen for 25 years and whom I met a long time ago in the United States while her family was fleeing from Bosnia. And after some time, she returned back to Sarajevo to live there. It was a very surprising decision to me. But then when I came there to meet her, I was on a trip with my son. We were in Croatia, so I just decided we must meet with my friend who just happened to live in Sarajevo. Maybe not a very tourist destination to go on, but I felt it will have a special meaning for me, and I really wanted to see my friend after all of these years. The important thing that being teenagers, while we became friends, we never once spoke about her wartime experience. And after sitting together after these years in Sarajevo, looking at the wounds on the buildings, on the houses, and absorbing this atmosphere of the survivor city that has suffered, but still it has this desire to live, and there's this desire for a feast even. We only could talk about the war, or the two wars that we both have experienced. So these experiences have created a shared space for us, and it's basically trauma that has created that shared space. And for me, that visit wasn't as painful as I thought it would be. It gave me a lot of hope. And it came not just from a conversation with my friend, sharing everything that she went through during the siege of Sarajevo, but also of her assurance that you will survive, life will get back to normal, it will not be the same as before, but it will go on. But it's also this presence of the city that has visible scars that you can almost touch with your fingers. The city that has survived and has this living spirit and the will to live and to feast, because this is an uncomparable atmosphere in Sarajevo. This is what really gave me some hope in that moment. And I said to my friend, I want us to have the same conversation after the war is over in Ukraine, and you will come to Lviv, and we will have another round.
Yeah, Yuliya, well, thank you for bringing us back to the beginning of this conversation and the question of survival. In that poem, as you've just described, you quote your friend saying that you will survive, although things will be different. And then you add that we will survive, although not all of us. Mm-hmm. What does it mean for you to survive? And Maria, a similar question to you. You speak very powerfully of cities surviving. We see so many Ukrainian cities and towns razed to the ground by Russia. What does it mean for a city to survive? And is it a helpful concept? Yuliya?
Maybe I will just start with what it means to survive, in my opinion, and then the city could be used as an example. Well, to me, survival means not only preserving the mere physical form to continue existing, but also to preserve the soul and the spirit, and this internal fire, this joy, and of course dignity, and the sense of belonging, the sense of connection. And this is true for both people and places. We've had a lot of discussions about how Ukraine should just let go of the occupied territories. And most of the people abroad do not realize that occupation is a slow death. This is also living in constant danger and living without dignity. Well, as I said, I mentioned Sarajevo, how people really have this visible spirit. You can almost feel it, despite of the physical wounds on their bodies sometimes, and the imprint of the war on their faces. You can feel the spirit. And when it comes to cities, we know that in Kharkiv, after a missile attack, a coffee shop would be open immediately, and they will apologize for the broken windows, and they will continue serve the delicious coffee and treat their visitors with the hospitality and warmth. And the cultural life in Kharkiv is ongoing. Among different projects, there are concerts, there are book events. There's this new radio station, Hartia, which has been very active in broadcasting about the life of both servicemen and women and civilians. So this is what it means really to survive, to continue living. And this is very different when what is compared just to mere existing, the absence of death.
If that's okay, I'll talk a little bit more about Sarajevo too, because there are very, very strong parallels, I think, between Bosnia and Ukraine, without sort of overlooking the profound differences as well. This was in the middle of Europe. This was 1 hour away from places where people were sitting in cafes and children were playing in parks. This was a country that was abandoned by the international community. In relation to Sarajevo itself, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, they were under siege for 1,395 days, which is, now this will be rewritten. It has already, But at the time, in the 90s, it was considered the longest siege in modern day history, right? And what Yulia was saying about Kharkiv, and we cannot say this about Mariupol, of course, but occupied territories, but what you're saying about Kharkiv, that is exactly what was happening in Sarajevo. There were fashion parades. There were universities. There were cinemas. Books were written. There was incredibly intense cultural life. And the survival of the city, there were people who were absolutely committed to their city in ways that they were not before. They merged with their city. That systematic, there was a new word, I think, coined to describe what was happening to Sarajevo, which is more than applicable to multiple cities in Ukraine, and that word is urbicide, the systematic and whole-scale destruction of a city, right? So, and the idea of Sarajevo was an abomination to Bosnian Serbs who were supported by Russians, because it was a multi-ethnic city in which the kind of mixing of ethnicities that you grew up in was absolutely the norm. So the city needed to be destroyed. The National Library was bombed and destroyed. It burned for 3 days, and people who were in Sarajevo wrote incredible poems about the black snow of the books from Sarajevo National Library. There is a phenomenologist, Edward C. Casey, who's a philosopher, phenomenologist, who's criticized. We can criticize everyone, right? But I think he has a concept that has really also been very illuminating to me, and his concept is people in places, ... as one thing. He believes that people in places are inseparable, and I think they may become inseparable. I think for those of you who are in Lviv, who stayed in Lviv, I suspect that kind of fusion might be happening, might have already happened, right? So he said it's meaningless to talk about people separate from the places where they found that deeper sense of belonging, and that sense that their fate as human beings and members of their family and community are entwined with the fate of their city, and therefore that is what needs to be honoured. So is it meaningful to talk about survival of cities? Yes, it is. It is very meaningful.
There's so much more we could ask you about your fantastic work, but our time is running out, sadly. We will have to return to this conversation. I really hope that we do. In the meantime, we're going to ask our listeners to read your brilliant work. And before we finish, as always, we're going to ask you to recommend books that our listeners should add to their Ukraine shelf. Maria, would you like to start?
So my recommendations are actually Bosnian literature written at the time of the siege. So, because I think that's... And then you can read what has been, because it finished at the start of 96, so, 20 years have passed, as Yulia said. And so you can read from inside, which is where we are, then 10 years, and then 20 years, I think. And as you said, Yulia, that gave you a lot of hope, that conversation. So I would recommend, so much was written during those 3.5 years, but I would recommend a war diary called Sarajevo Days, Sarajevo Nights by Elma Softic, Miljenka Jergovic, Sarajevo Marlborough, which I think is easy to remember, and my favorite, a book of documentary poems, if you like, Semizdin Memedinovic, Sarajevo Blues.
Super, thank you. Yulia, what about you?
Well, I would like to recommend a book of frontline poetry by Artur Dronj, a young soldier poet, and this book is called We Were Here, and it was published in the UK last year by Yantar Publishing, and I had an honor and immense pleasure of translating this book into English together with an editorial team from the UK. I should thank Professors Hugh Roberts and Helen Vassallo from the University of Exeter, and the poets Fiona Benson and Charlotte Shevchenko-Knight. And I should stress that it is probably the first full-length collection of a Ukrainian soldier poet that has been translated into English. And Artur wrote it while serving on the front line. And this poetry speaks not so much about the combat itself, but about the people that he meets and these profound transformations that he undergoes as a cultural manager turned soldier, as a Christian and a firm believer, redefining his relationship with God, which has resulted in strengthened faith. And as a poet, which is shaped by these unprecedented challenges that he faces and the atrocities he witnesses, and there's no despair in this book. There's a lot of course, a lot of fury, but it's a calm fury, and there's determination, and there's a lot of hope. And when Artur Dronj speaks of hope, he always speaks about children. And this is especially moving coming from a young man who is yesterday's kid, who has been forced to mature too quickly in the face of the existential threat to his country. And in order to carry hope for the children of today and tomorrow, and for all of us really, and we should all remember, and I will remind once again, that the global democracy rests on the shoulders of these men and women, the brave Ukrainian army, and this alone is a reason enough to read this book, beyond the fact that it's quite simply a fascinating work of poetry.
It definitely is. It's a really beautiful book. Thank you so much for these recommendations. If you didn't catch any of the names of the books or the authors, please check the website of the UCL European Institute or the episode descriptions on YouTube or elsewhere, where we provide lists of our guests' books and also of all the books that they recommend. It remains for me now just to thank our amazing guests, Maria Tumarkin, Yuliya Musakovska, and also our hosts, Index Center for Documentation and Exchange, and also Dim Zvuku here in Lviv for hosting us. Please check out our previous episodes of the Ukraine Shelf. If you enjoyed the podcast, leave us a like or a comment and recommend it to your friends. And in the meantime, keep reading about Ukraine.